The moment Oliver Crane stepped over that rope, everything changed. Not in a dramatic, movie-style way, not with sirens or shouts or someone grabbing him by the collar. It changed in the worst possible way, quietly in front of everyone, with no one doing a single thing to stop it, because that was the point. That was the whole terrifying, humiliating point that Oliver would not understand until much later, standing in a different country, in a different life, wondering how a single afternoon in London had rewired something deep inside him. But we are not there yet. We are here on a warm Tuesday in July, outside Buckingham Palace, where 14-year-old Oliver Crane is doing what Oliver Crane does best, making sure everyone around him knows exactly how little he thinks of them. Oliver was not a bad kid in the way that word usually gets used. He had never been in a real fight. He had never broken a law that mattered. He got decent grades, showed up to school on time, and could, when he wanted to, be genuinely funny. The problem was that he almost never wanted to. Wanting to be kind required effort, and effort required humility, and humility was a word Oliver associated with losing. He had grown up in a house in Connecticut where his father, Gerald Crane, ran a mid-sized contracting company and spoke about money the way some people speak about religion, constantly, reverently, and with the implication that those who did not have enough of it had made some kind of moral error. Gerald was not a cruel man. He was just a man who had confused his bank account with his character for so long that the two had merged completely, and children, more than anything, absorb what is modeled for them. Oliver's mother, Caroline, was softer by nature. She read books, she apologized to waiters. She sometimes left extra money on the table at restaurants because she felt the tip had not been enough. But she had spent 14 years slowly, quietly losing arguments with Gerald, and by the time Oliver was old enough to observe the pattern, the lesson was already encoded. Softness was weakness, and weakness was the one thing no Crane should ever display. So Oliver performed strength the only way a 14-year-old boy knows how. He was loud, he was dismissive. He rolled his eyes at teachers, at slow walkers, at anything that required him to wait or adjust or consider that another person's experience might matter as much as his own. London had been his mother's idea. Caroline had wanted culture. She had wanted museums and history and the kind of slow, absorbing travel that changes the way a person thinks about the world. She had wanted it for herself, yes, but more than that, she had wanted it for Oliver. She had been watching him in the way that attentive mothers watch their children, and she had seen something underneath the loudness that worried her, a kind of brittleness, like a boy who had built his whole identity on a surface that was thinner than it looked. She booked the trip in April. Flights, a hotel near Hyde Park, a loose itinerary that included the British Museum, the Tower of London, the National Gallery, and one afternoon at Buckingham Palace. Gerald thought it was unnecessary. Oliver thought it was going to be boring. Caroline booked it anyway. They arrived on a Sunday. Oliver spent most of the first day on his phone, trailing behind his parents through the arrivals hall of Heathrow, commenting on things, the accents, the weather, the size of the cars, in a tone that suggested England had personally failed to meet his standards. By Monday, he had found his rhythm. Two boys from his school, Nathan Cole and Pete Ashworth, had coincidentally booked a family holiday in London at the same time, and after a hurried exchange of messages, the three of them had arranged to meet up Tuesday afternoon while their parents did separate things. Caroline hesitated. Gerald said it would be fine. Oliver was already putting his shoes on. The three of them arrived at Buckingham Palace at just past 2 in the afternoon. The palace was exactly what it looked like in every photograph Oliver had ever ignored. A wide, flat, cream-colored facade at the end of a long approach, with iron gates and a forecourt, and stationed at the corners and along the perimeter, the Queen's Guard. Nathan saw the guard first and stopped. "He's not going to move," Nathan said. "He looks fake," Pete said. Oliver said nothing. He was already studying the guard the way he studied most things, not with curiosity but with calculation, looking for the angle, looking for the crack. The guard was tall, probably 6 feet 2, maybe more. He stood in a small wooden sentry box to the right of the central gate, rifle held vertically at his side, his face hidden in shadow beneath the enormous black bearskin hat that sat on his head like a statement. His uniform was immaculate, the deep red tunic, the white belt, the polished brass buttons catching the afternoon light in a way that seemed almost deliberate. His face was forward, his eyes fixed at some point in the middle distance that did not include any of the tourists gathered along the barrier rope. He was completely, perfectly still. That stillness was what did it. Oliver had grown up in a world where attention was currency and stillness felt like poverty. A person who would not react was a person who had decided that you were not worth reacting to. And that, for a boy whose entire identity rested on being noticed, on mattering, on taking up space, was something his nervous system could not accept without pushing back. He started small, a wave, the kind you give a friend across a parking lot, exaggerated and slow. Nothing. A hello, loud enough for the people around him to hear. Nothing. He looked back at Nathan and Pete. Nathan grinned. Pete had his phone up, recording. The small crowd along the barrier rope, tourists mostly, a few families with young children, a couple of older men in light jackets, watched with the mild interest of people who had seen this before and already knew how it ended. Oliver did not know how it ended. He stepped over the barrier rope. Not far, 6 inches, maybe 8, just enough to be on the wrong side of it, just enough for the act to mean something. A woman nearby said something under her breath. A man in a blue jacket took a step toward him, then stopped. Oliver turned to Nathan with the specific grin of a boy who believes he is being watched admiringly. Then he said something to the guard. He said it at a volume that carried. He said it with the particular confidence of someone who has never once in 14 years experienced a real consequence. It was not a threat, it was not something violent or truly wrong in the legal sense of the word, but it was disrespectful in a way that went past rudeness into something uglier, the kind of comment designed not to provoke a reaction, but to demonstrate to the audience behind him that the person he was saying it to was beneath his consideration. The guard did not blink. His eyes did not move. His jaw did not tighten. Not one muscle in his face registered that Oliver Crane existed. Oliver stood there for 3 full seconds, which, in that kind of silence, in front of that kind of stillness, feels much longer than 3 seconds, and felt something happen that he had no word for at the time. He felt the floor disappear. Not literally, he was standing on solid stone in bright afternoon sunshine, surrounded by people. But the floor of his identity, the thing he stood on when he performed confidence, the invisible platform his personality was built on, dropped out from under him, and for a moment he was just a boy. Just a 14-year-old boy standing on the wrong side of a rope in a foreign city, having said something unkind to someone who had responded by looking straight through him. He stepped back over the rope. He turned to Nathan, who was still grinning, and he laughed. He shrugged. He made a comment about the guard being a robot, and Nathan laughed, and Pete laughed, and Oliver laughed loudest of all. But the laugh did not go all the way down. It stopped somewhere around his chest and went no further, and he knew it. And he spent the rest of that afternoon covering the gap with noise, more comments, more jokes, more of the familiar performance, while underneath it, something quiet and unfamiliar sat in the place where the floor used to be. He did not tell anyone about it. Not Nathan, not Pete, not his mother, who picked him up at 5 and asked how the afternoon was, and he said fine, and she looked at him for a moment longer than usual and then said nothing. He lay in the hotel bed that night staring at the ceiling while his parents slept in the room next door, listening to London doing its quiet nighttime things outside the window, and tried to identify the feeling. It was not embarrassment exactly. He had been embarrassed before. Embarrassment was sharp and hot and faded fast. This was something else. This was the slow, creeping recognition that the thing he had walked up to, that still, silent, utterly composed man in the red uniform, had not ignored him out of weakness or stupidity or programming. It had ignored him out of something that looked, from the inside of Oliver's chest, uncomfortably like strength. And that was the part he could not shake. He fell asleep with it unresolved, which was new. Oliver Crane was not a boy who went to sleep with unresolved things. He usually buried them, or laughed them off, or simply refused to let them be real. This one would not cooperate. It sat on the edge of his bed all night, patient and still, and waited for morning. The next day began the way most days in London began for Oliver, with his mother trying to put together a plan and Oliver resisting it out of habit more than genuine feeling. Caroline had the British Museum on the itinerary. Oliver said it sounded slow. She said it would be interesting. He said that was what people said about things that were not interesting. She looked at him over her coffee cup, said nothing, put the museum brochure in her bag. They went to the museum. Oliver did not admit then or later that it was extraordinary. But he walked through the Egyptian galleries in a particular kind of silence, not the bored silence of someone enduring an obligation, but the slightly stunned silence of someone who has just encountered something too large to dismiss. He stood in front of the Rosetta Stone for longer than he intended. He told himself it was because his feet hurt. But the thing from the day before was still there. still sitting at the edge of his awareness like a stone in a shoe he had decided not to stop and remove. That afternoon, Caroline had arranged tea at a small hotel near Green Park, the kind of place with white tablecloths and tiny sandwiches, and a general atmosphere that Oliver would normally have spent 20 minutes mocking. He was still building up to the first joke when the man at the next table spoke. He was perhaps 60 years old, square-shouldered, with the kind of posture that looks less like effort and more like something built in long ago and never lost. His hair was gray at the temples. He wore a plain dark jacket with a small pin on the lapel, a regimental badge, though Oliver did not know that yet. He was reading a newspaper and drinking tea and had given no indication that he was aware of Oliver's existence. Then he looked up, not at Oliver specifically, just up in the general direction of the table, in the way older people sometimes do when they are gathering a thought. "You were at the palace yesterday," he said. Oliver blinked. "Sorry. Buckingham Palace, yesterday afternoon." "You were there?" It was not a question. Oliver looked at his mother, who looked back with an expression that said, "This is as surprising to me as it is to you." "Yeah," Oliver said, "we were tourists." The man nodded, returned to his tea, stirred it slowly, the spoon moving in small, unhurried circles. Then he said, without looking up, "I was there 40 years ago, in the uniform." Oliver's mother set down her cup. The man did not elaborate on that. He did not look up or gesture or lean forward the way people do when they want to be sure you understand they are saying something important. He just stirred his tea, and the silence around the sentence sat there in the afternoon light, occupying space. Oliver, who normally filled silences the way water fills a container, said nothing. The man's name was Edward Holt. They would learn this later, after a conversation that began sideways and arrived somewhere none of them expected. He had served in the household division for 8 years. He had stood outside those same gates, in that same uniform, in heat and rain and bitter London cold, for hundreds of hours across 3 years of ceremonial duty. He had been looked at, mocked, tested, photographed, waved at, ignored, and on one occasion had a tourist from somewhere in Europe attempt to physically remove his hat while his face remained perfectly forward. He did not tell Oliver any of this directly. He mentioned pieces of it the way you mention weather, casually, incidentally, as context rather than revelation. And Oliver, who was not used to listening, found himself listening. "People think the training is about the stillness," Edward said at one point. "Standing still for long periods, controlling your body, that's part of it, but that's not the point." Oliver waited. "The point is deciding what deserves your response." Edward finally looked at him. His eyes were calm, a pale gray-blue, and there was nothing challenging in them. Nothing that said, "I know what you did yesterday," just a steady, matter-of-fact attention. Most things don't. Most provocations, most noise, it's not about you, it's about the person making it. When you understand that, you stop reacting to it, not because you're ignoring it, because you've already accounted for it and moved past it. He picked up his newspaper again. Takes a while to learn, for most people. He did not look at Oliver when he said that last part. He did not need to. The sentence was not aimed. It simply existed in the air of the room, available to anyone who wanted to pick it up. Oliver stared at his plate, at the small triangular sandwich sitting on the white china, at the particular pattern of the tablecloth, at nothing. His mother reached across the table and put her hand over his. He did not pull away. That was new, too. The flight home was on a Friday morning. Oliver spent most of it with his headphones in, which was normal, but he was not listening to anything, which was not. He sat with the headphones on and no music playing and watched the clouds outside the window, and turned the week over in his mind like a stone he was checking all the surfaces of. He thought about the guard, about the absolute refusal to acknowledge him, about the way the stillness had felt like power rather than absence, about the 3 seconds he had stood there on the wrong side of the rope and felt himself become small. He thought about Edward Holt and the quiet, unhurried way the man had said things that landed like weights. He thought about his father, at home in Connecticut, who responded to everything, every slight, every slow driver, every perceived disrespect, with immediate visible heat, who wore his reactions on his face like badges. Who had always seemed, to Oliver, like a man in control, because he was always the loudest person in the room. And Oliver, sitting 35,000 feet above the Atlantic, tried for the first time to hold those two images next to each other. The man who reacted to everything. The man who chose what deserved his response. He did not arrive at any conclusions on that flight. He was 14, not a philosopher. But something had shifted in the architecture of the way he saw the world, and the shift was quiet and structural, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind you only recognize later when you look back and notice that something is standing differently than it used to. He landed in Connecticut on a Friday afternoon. His father picked them up at the airport and talked about work for most of the drive home. Oliver sat in the back seat and looked out the window and said very little. Gerald noticed, "You seem quiet." "I'm fine," Oliver said. Gerald looked at Caroline. She looked back at him with an expression he did not quite read. That night Oliver sat at his desk and opened a notebook. He had kept notebooks before, briefly, and always abandoned them after 3 entries because the act of writing things down felt uncomfortably like taking them seriously. He uncapped a pen and wrote 1 sentence on the first page. Then he closed the notebook and put it in the drawer and went to sleep. Neither of his parents ever saw what he wrote. The notebook got lost in a move when he was 17. He would not be able to tell you the exact wording if you asked him now. But the sentence was something along the lines of, "A person who doesn't react isn't weak. They have already decided you are not the point." He was not sure yet what to do with that. But he kept it. High school arrived the following September, and Oliver Crane arrived with it, changed in a way that was invisible to most people and unmistakable to the ones who paid attention. He was still sharp, still quick. He still had the wit that had always been his most natural tool, the ability to find the funny angle on almost anything and deliver it in a way that made people laugh whether they wanted to or not. That did not go away, but something in the application of it changed. He became, over the course of that first year, more selective, more deliberate. He stopped aiming it at people who hadn't earned it. He started aiming it at situations, at absurdities, at the gaps between how things were supposed to work and how they actually did. His teachers noticed, not all of them and not immediately, but the ones who noticed things noticed. His English teacher, a woman named Helen Marsh, who had been teaching for 22 years and had developed a precise, unsparing radar for students who were using intelligence as a defense mechanism versus students who were genuinely becoming someone, watched Oliver across his freshman and sophomore years with something close to cautious interest. She gave an assignment in his sophomore year, a personal essay, open topic, 3 pages minimum. Oliver wrote about London. Not about the palace specifically, not about the guard by name or the rope or the moment of stepping over it. He wrote around it, the way you write around something that is still slightly too bright to look at directly. He wrote about a man he had met for an afternoon over tea who had said something about deciding what deserves your response and how that sentence had followed him home and refused to leave. Helen Marsh read the essay twice. She wrote 2 words in the margin at the end, "Keep going." Oliver did not know at 15 that those 2 words would matter, but they did. They mattered in the specific way that a teacher's recognition matters to a student who has spent years performing rather than revealing, which is to say, they mattered enormously, in a quiet way that he kept entirely to himself. He kept going. Nathan Coles, who had filmed the moment outside the palace on his phone, had posted the video briefly and then deleted it at Oliver's request the day after it was taken. Oliver had asked directly, without excuse or explanation, and Nathan, surprised by the directness, had deleted it without asking why. It never became a story anyone told, not because it was hidden, but because Oliver never gave it the shape of a story worth telling. He never brought it up, he never referenced it. It existed for years as a private thing, an interior hinge, a before and after point that he carried without advertisement. Pete Ashworth moved to Edinburgh at the end of 8th grade. Nathan Cole and Oliver stayed loosely in touch through high school, the kind of friendship that survives on occasional text messages and shared history but does not grow much. Nathan became a good rugby player and a mediocre student and a genuinely decent person, and at their graduation he and Oliver shook hands and said they would keep in touch and mostly did not, which was fine by both of them. Oliver's father remained his father. That did not change the way Oliver had perhaps, in some quiet and naive part of himself, hoped it might. Gerald Crane was still the loudest person in any room he walked into, still measured everything in terms of what it cost and what it produced, still spoke about people who had less as though they had chosen it. Oliver loved him because he was his father, and fathers get loved even when they are difficult and sometimes especially then, but he stopped wanting to be him. That was the change, and it was not a small one. His mother knew. Caroline had been watching carefully and without comment since that Friday afternoon when Oliver came home from London and sat in the back seat of the car and said nothing. She had watched him read more, watch less, respond to provocation more slowly and with more thought. She had watched him at a family dinner when he was 16, sit quietly while a cousin twice his age said something dismissive about a mutual friend, and then say, calmly and without heat, that he thought the cousin was wrong about that, and here was why. The table had gone briefly quiet. Gerald had looked at his son with an expression Caroline could not quite read. Oliver had returned to his food without drama. That night after the guests left and Gerald was watching television, Caroline found Oliver in the kitchen making himself a cup of tea, a habit he had picked up from London and never lost, and she stood in the doorway for a moment and watched him. "You've gotten good at that," she said. He looked up at what? She thought about how to say it. At knowing when to speak. Oliver held the mug with both hands, looked at the steam rising from it. "I had a good teacher," he said. She assumed he meant Helen Marsh. She was not entirely wrong. The summer Oliver turned 18, he went back to London. Not with his parents this time. He went with a friend from school, a quiet and thoughtful boy named Daniel Fraser who wanted to study architecture and spent most of the trip photographing building details that other people walked past without looking at. They were good travel companions, the kind of two people who can spend 6 hours in the same city going entirely different directions and still have dinner together without the gap feeling like failure. Oliver did not plan to go back to Buckingham Palace. It was not on their itinerary, and the itinerary was Daniel's, and Daniel was more interested in the Barbican and the Royal Festival Hall than in ceremonial traditions. But on the third afternoon, Oliver found himself walking through St. James's Park toward the palace without having made a conscious decision to do so. He stood at the barrier rope. A different guard was posted at the sentry box, shorter, younger-looking, though you could not be sure under the hat. The afternoon crowd was thinner than it had been 4 years ago, a Tuesday in early June rather than a peak summer Saturday. A few families, a few couples, a man sketching in a notebook. Oliver stood at the rope and looked at the guard for a long time. He did not step over, did not wave, did not make a sound. He just stood there on the right side of the barrier and looked. And what he felt standing there at 18 with 4 years of private, unannounced change sitting quietly inside him was something he did not have a word for in English, something adjacent to gratitude, but that was not quite it, something closer to recognition. The feeling of meeting something again that was exactly as you remembered it and understanding that the change was entirely on your side. The guard stood still. The afternoon moved around him like water around a stone. Oliver stood there until a family with young children arrived beside him, the kids pointing and exclaiming in the excited, unguarded way of children encountering something magnificent for the first time, and he stepped back to give them room, and then he turned and walked back through the park toward the hotel. He did not tell Daniel about it. He ordered fish and chips for dinner, and they talked about architecture until the restaurant closed. He slept well that night, better than he usually did when he traveled. The years after that moved the way years do when a person is genuinely building something with a sense of direction that only becomes clear in retrospect. Oliver studied at a university in the north of England because the scholarship he received was too good to refuse, and because some part of him had decided at 18 that he wanted to stay near London rather than return to Connecticut. He studied education, which surprised his father and did not surprise his mother at all. He was 22 when he did his first teaching placement. Secondary school, mathematics, a school in a part of Manchester where the classrooms were full and the budgets were not. He walked in on his first morning with a moderate amount of terror and a very specific memory, the memory of a man standing utterly still, while a 14-year-old boy tried everything he had to get a reaction, and he used it the way you use something you have been carrying for a long time without quite knowing why. His first difficult student arrived in the second week. A boy named Callum Wright, 13 years old in the third row, who had the specific combination of intelligence and restlessness that tends to express itself as disruption. He talked when Oliver was talking. He made comments designed for his classmates rather than the lesson. He leaned back in his chair at an angle that communicated comprehensive boredom with everything happening around him. Oliver recognized him the way you recognize a photograph of yourself from a long time ago. He did not raise his voice. He did not issue warnings or threats or reminders about school policy. He looked at Callum when Callum was being most disruptive, with a calm, steady attention that was not punishing and was not aggressive and was simply present, the full, unhurried weight of a person who had decided that this moment, and this student, deserved genuine consideration. Callum did not know what to do with that. Nobody had ever looked at him that way. By the fourth week, Callum was the student who stayed after class to ask questions he would not ask in front of the others. By the end of the term, he had passed his interim assessment with a score that surprised his previous teachers and did not surprise Oliver. That was the pattern, year after year, class after class, student after student, not every student, not perfectly, and not without setbacks and failures and days when Oliver went home tired in a way that went all the way down. Teaching is not a story with a clean arc. It is a long, unglamorous, deeply important accumulation of small moments, most of which no one ever sees or acknowledges. But the thing Oliver had brought back from London, the quiet, durable understanding that choosing not to react is itself a choice, and often the most powerful one, showed up in his classroom every single day. It was in the 3 seconds he gave himself before responding to a difficult question. It was in the way he heard a student's tone without being controlled by it. It was in the steadiness his classes came to recognize and eventually to trust. He had students over the years who were where he had been at 14. He could see it clearly, the performance of confidence over the brittleness underneath, the need to be the loudest voice as a substitute for feeling genuinely solid. He never addressed it directly. He never called it out or named it in front of anyone. He simply taught mathematics and conducted himself with a quiet consistency that gave those students something to look at, a model of a person who did not need the room to confirm that he existed. Some of them picked it up. Some of them did not. He did not keep score. Gerald Crane had a heart attack when Oliver was 24. It was not fatal, but it was serious, and it rearranged things in the family in the way serious events always do, bringing some things closer and leaving others looking different in the changed light. Oliver flew back to Connecticut and sat in the hospital corridor and drank bad coffee and talked to his mother in the particular compressed, honest way that hospital corridors produce. She asked him at some point during that long night what he was most proud of. He thought about it genuinely, not the automatic answers, his degree, his job, the placement scores his students had achieved. He thought about it as a real question. "I think," he said, "I'm proud that I stopped needing to be the one who made the most noise." Caroline looked at him. Her eyes were tired and her coffee was cold, and she had been sitting in a plastic chair for 6 hours. "When did that happen?" she said. "London," he said, "when I was 14. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I knew something happened that day. You never told me." "I stepped over the barrier rope," he said, "outside the palace. I said something to the guard, something I'm not proud of." "What did he do?" Oliver held his cup. "Nothing. That was the whole thing. He did absolutely nothing. And it was the most effective response anyone has ever given me." Caroline looked down at the floor. When she looked up, she was almost smiling. "Good," she said. Gerald recovered. He was quieter after the heart attack, not permanently, not completely, but in the particular way that people who have been frightened by their own bodies become occasionally, genuinely still. Oliver noticed it on the visits home, noticed his father listening more sometimes, noticed him sitting at the dinner table without reaching for his phone. It was not a transformation. It was a small softening in a hard material, and Oliver did not name it or push it or need it to be more than it was. He went back to Manchester and back to his classroom, and back to the long, unglamorous work of teaching children how to think mathematically, which is really just teaching them how to sit with a problem that does not yet have an answer and stay in the room with it until it does. He was good at that. He had learned it from a man who stood still for a living. Edward Holt died on a Wednesday in November, when Oliver was 26. Oliver did not know this when it happened. He would not know it for another 3 months, when he came across a brief obituary notice in an online archive he had no real reason to be reading. He had been looking up something related to the household division for a school lesson on British history, and the name surfaced in a tangential search result, and he sat very still at his desk for a long moment after reading it. The obituary was short. It said that Edward Holt had served 8 years in the household division, had worked subsequently in security consulting, had been married for 31 years to a woman named Patricia, and had 2 adult children. It noted his love of gardening and his long membership in a local historical society. It said he was remembered for his quiet generosity and his patience. Oliver read it twice. Then he closed the browser and sat back in his chair and looked at the wall of his flat, the wall where he had pinned, when he moved in, a small photograph he had taken on his second trip to London, not of the palace, not of the guard. Of St. James's Park in early June, the trees in full leaf, the path dappled with afternoon light, a couple of pigeons going about their pigeonish business in the foreground. He had put it there because it reminded him of the afternoon he had walked back through the park at 18, quietly changed, not needing to announce it to anyone. He looked at it for a while. Then he got up, made himself a cup of tea, and went to the desk to finish preparing his lesson for tomorrow. He did not tell anyone about Edward Holt, not his mother, not his colleagues, not the friend he had dinner with that Friday. It was not a secret. It was simply a private thing, the kind of thing that belongs to the interior of a life rather than the performance of one. He taught his lesson the next morning. Quadratic equations, year 10, 32 students in a room that was slightly too warm. He stood at the front of the class and explained the method with the calm, patient clarity that his students had come to take for granted, because consistency, practiced long enough, becomes invisible. In the third row, a girl named Alice Rowe was having a bad morning. Oliver could see it, the set of her jaw, the way she was holding her pen too tightly, the small, deliberate inattention of someone who was not actually disengaged but was trying very hard to look like it. He did not call on her, he did not address it directly. He continued teaching and let the lesson do what a good lesson does, which is create enough structure and interest that even a person in a difficult mood can find a handhold somewhere in it. Halfway through, Alice Rowe started writing things down. Oliver noticed, he gave no sign that he had. He kept his attention distributed across the whole room, kept his voice level, kept the pace of the lesson steady. After class, as students filed out, Alice Rowe paused by the door. "Sir," she said. "Yes." She looked like she was not sure what she wanted to say. "Thanks," she said, "for not making a thing of it." He looked at her for a moment. "There was no thing to make," he said. She left. He stood in the empty classroom for a moment after the door closed. The afternoon light was coming through the windows at a low angle, falling across the desks in long, thin bars. The whiteboard still had the quadratic formula written on it, half erased from the beginning of the lesson. He thought about a guard who had not made a thing of it, who had looked straight through a 14-year-old boy and seen, perhaps not an enemy, not an annoyance, but just a person who had not yet learned what deserved his attention. He thought about how long it takes to understand something that was communicated in 3 seconds. He picked up an eraser and cleared the whiteboard, and he gathered his things, and he turned off the light, and he walked out into the corridor where the next class was already arriving, already loud, already full of the particular chaotic energy of young people who are figuring out who they are and do not yet know how to be quiet about it. He held the door open for them. He said good morning. He went back to work.